Here today with Andrea Ettekal, assistant professor at Texas A&M in College Station, Texas. And Andrea, I'd like to start out by having you explain a little bit about your academic background and work as it pertains to youth fitness.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, David. It's always a great conversation with you. So what am I doing now? I am an assistant professor in the Applied Youth Development Initiative here at Texas A&M, and I do research on youth out of school time settings. So I look at the different ways that youth spend their out of school time, their leisure time. I use a strengths-based approach, which we call positive youth development in this world, which I know is familiar in your world as well, PYD. I'm through and through a PYD person. So I look at the ways that youth can spend their free time in productive ways to grow strengths. One of those ways and one of those settings that I study is physical activity, either in an organized fashion through sport or informal physical activity, just exercise and the physical nature of hanging out with friends and that kind of stuff. I look at many different benefits, so I won't put myself in a box of what kind of outcomes I look at. But in general, youth well-being.
And what are the main benefits that you do see from youth fitness, whether it's formal programs or free play or whatever?
Oh, wow, that's a big question. I'll tell you the ones I find the most sort of exciting. One is just the experience, like in the free play form, it's just the experience of exploration and the experience of getting to know your body and finding your connection between your mind and your body and the spiritual connection with your body. I think for a long time, we've finally, thank goodness, gotten out of the idea that our body is disconnected, like our physical form is disconnected from our mental well-being. I think we know very well now that our physical body is intertwined with our spiritual and mental health. So I think some of the outcomes I get most excited about is the self-exploration aspect of identity development, learning who you are, where you fit into this world. The stronger you can be physically, the better mental health outcomes that we see. We know well now that depression and anxiety we need to face that more intentionally. Physical fitness is a strong protective factor for mental health. And I would also put into this bucket character development, and not just in the moral sense of what's right and what's wrong, but character in the sense of being a whole person and being an integrated person and understanding how the different facets of your life come together to make you a whole person.
That's fantastic. What a great, I want your job. That's a great field. That's really cool. In terms of integration, like I understand after years and years in this field what you mean by that, and I've seen it happen through sports and fitness. But how does that translate to, say a 7 to 10 year old, which is kind of the wheelhouse of whom Fit Kids is serving?
That is a really good question. That's a really good question. The best way that I like to sort of think about it is as integration compared to compartmentalization. And this idea that sometimes as young kids, and this is natural with the way cognitive development works, as kids grow up, they understand the world by categorizing things and by categorizing themselves in different boxes. And this is also how rules and policies function in society. There's a certain way that you're supposed to be when you're in school. There are certain rules that you follow in your family. But this can lead to a compartmentalization related to our identity that when I'm in school, I'm a student. When I am at home, I am a son or a daughter. When I am with my friends, I am a peer. And the more those become disconnected, and we sort of like put on a different disguise in these different settings, the less our being becomes integrated. So for young kids, it's about you. Yes, you need to recognize that there are different rules and different norms associated with these different contexts. But just because you, for example, are perceived one way in school, maybe in school you're perceived as the nerd, it doesn't mean when you step out onto the soccer field, you can't also be perceived as a jock or as someone who's fit.
To a certain extent, kids will discover that on their own as they play, right? And that's part of the purpose of play and part of the what distinguishes it from classroom work and family life, because it's free flowing and there's immediate cause and effect perceptions, even if that, like I said, 7 to 10-year-old has never heard of cause and effect. It becomes obvious. At the same time, when we talk about a structured fitness program like Fit Kids, or a youth sports scenario, if there's some adult leadership, they have to be intentional about the character education elements and what they convey to kids. So what is your take on that in general? And then maybe specifically, what kind of language could those adult leaders be using to help kids achieve that integration?
This is a good question. I think this is also what I perceive to be the biggest challenge right now in the out of school time fields. So we know from decades of research that there are a lot of resources in youth's environments to help them grow strengths. There's programming, there are services, there's educational resources, books, there's resources everywhere. In every single scenario, the most important resource is always people. It's always the person. And for youth in the out of school time setting, it's the adult leader. And one of the challenges with adult leaders is that they're not supervisors, they're mentors. And that's a very big difference of being someone who stands on the sideline and just makes sure that kids don't get injured, versus an adult who invests in understanding a child and helping a child grow. So that's one shift, I think, that as the adult you have to make. And sometimes we also, as an adult, we become compartmentalized in the way we support youth, in that I have this youth with me for 1 hour today, and I just need to be concerned about what we do in this hour. And that's the worst thing you can do for a kid. You have to be concerned about what family that kid comes from, what's that kid's experiences at school, what kinds of things, what are this kid's sparks, what are their passions. Like, you have to understand the whole child to be able to best support the child. So we have to move away from being a supervisor and toward being a mentor. We have to move away from compartmentalizing and viewing the child within their whole system, within their whole life system. I think we also have to invest and understand that relationships are long term. They're not one off. I spend a day with you and I've done something for you. That when we work with kids as adults, that we're investing in relationships. Why this is so hard? Most of the adults in the out of school time sector are volunteers, and they're doing this. The pro of this and what we can capitalize on is most adults are in that position because they care.
Right.
But also, or maybe and also, most of these adults are also untrained. And you can't impose a lot of restrictions and policies and training requirements on adults who volunteer their time. So I think that's, in one way, maybe this is me out loud adjusting my own expectations, but also grappling with the reality of, if we really want to support integrated development among youth, we really need to be trained to do that. It's not going to just happen because I care.
So I guess schools and youth organizations can screen for that sort of thing in their volunteers if they're mindful of the challenges and the broader goals of their programs. um, this is maybe a more of a generalization than is completely healthy to make, but I feel like that is an even greater challenge at under-resourced organizations and schools, which is primarily where Fit Kids does its work. So can you talk a little bit about how to handle that? It's maybe more of an administrative question than is in your immediate expertise, but if you've got some thoughts on it, I'd love to hear them. And then particularly, what do we need to be aware of when working with children more likely exposed to trauma than the average?
Okay, one important piece here when you're working with under-resourced youth or marginalized youth or youth who experience oppression in systemic ways is representation. And at the bare minimum, having adults in these kids' lives who look like them, who come from the places they come from, who talk like them, who they can relate with at a minimum level. I think that's a challenge in and of itself. I think one way that we can help adult leaders, knowing that we're not paying you much in many cases. If we are paying you, it's definitely not much. So we're really asking you to do this out of the goodness of your heart. When we have that kind of an ask, we really have to empower people and find their reason for being there. So one of the best things we can do that is give them autonomy. You know, when we ask adults to come in and volunteer and then we impose a bunch of structure around them and say, but you can only do X, Y, Z, they're not empowered to be there. They need to feel like they have ownership. They need to feel like they have a meaningful contribution. So I think sometimes as management, little things that we can do is recognition and just helping them to understand their impact and to understand their potential impact if they choose to invest in an intentional way. And so I mean more than just praise, more than just high fives. You know, I spend time evaluating programs, and much of the evaluation work related to these kinds of programs focuses on youth outcomes. I've been moving in a direction where I'm encouraging youth serving organizations collect data on your staff and help your staff see their own development in this role, in the way that helping youth impacts themselves.
What occurred to me as you were speaking is that if the adult leader can't bring his or her whole self, how can they expect the child to bring their whole self and become their whole self?
Yeah, you know what word comes to my mind when I hear that is authenticity. I think sometimes as adults we're afraid to be authentic with youth, but I think that is the greatest gift we can give youth is being authentic and being vulnerable with them. Now that doesn't mean sharing, you know, your own life story and dealing with, you know, have your own issues with youth. It just means being a real person and letting them see that side of you.
That's great. I do want to get to the other part of that question before about specific ways to work with kids who've been through trauma, or you know, and even if it's not acute trauma, I would say that the ongoing more, I don't know, steady trauma that comes with being oppressed, or even being poor, you know, and just some of the endemic challenges that go with that. How can the coaches, leaders, et cetera, have at least a glimpse, and especially if they are untrained? I mean, if you could give them a 3-minute crash course in how to deal with this, because it's real and they're not going to get the training. Dr. Ettekal, will you train them?
Very poorly, but I will. Here's what I would say in that world. You know, I don't have specific expertise in trauma, but I have done some professional development work on understanding the role of trauma when you're working with youth. So here are some things that I would say. First, I would say everyone has trauma. It's maybe not big T trauma, but everyone has some accumulation of maybe lowercase t trauma that matters. And that matters significantly in the person that you are and why you're the person you are and your purposes and your goals and who you want to be. So one, get rid of the idea that you think trauma is only about, surviving wars or mass relocation, like that kind of stuff. So that's the first thing I would say. The second thing that I would say is we're not all trained to deal with trauma. So it doesn't mean that you have to become a counselor to be able to help youth. That if things are beyond your reach and things feel too big to deal with, you need to have resources on hand. And you need to have places to refer youth, and you need to understand the difference between we're having a casual conversation about a bad day versus this kid's carrying a heavy load because they were abused. Another one that I would say is, but that means you can't ignore it. That when kids come to us, they come to us with a history, with a life history. And even if the trauma that they experienced were when they were younger, or maybe they're not currently experiencing trauma, they're carrying it with them. And we also now know that we carry our trauma in our nervous system, literally in our physical bodies. So being aware of, especially when you're doing things like fitness and you're using your physical body, that when kids are dealing with trauma, there's going to be physical limitations as well. That when we talk about trauma or we cope with trauma, it matters in our physical body. So it's not this idea that, well, you might be going through something that affects you mentally, but you should be able to get out there and work out. Trauma's in my body. Be careful with our expectations of youth when we're dealing with trauma. Does that make sense?
Sure it does, of course. Yeah, and you did a much better job at that than you were claiming at the beginning of that answer. That's wonderful, and I think that should be well within the grasp of most adult leaders, who have any level of sensitivity and aren't just kind of out there going through emotions. That sounds immediately implementable. I'm also curious about just if you've got examples from your field work. I assume you don't sit in a lab all day and that you go out and see people and meet people. Are there any remarkable instances that come to mind? And it's fine if the answer is no, but if you have seen individual kids turn corners in their lives based on their fitness or sports experiences, would love to hear about any of those.
Yeah, the case that comes to my mind, this is actually a really simple story, but changed this kid's life that I worked with. I was working with a teen who I wasn't working directly with this teen. It was through a program. But it was a kid who had experienced a lot of trauma in their life. And he didn't even know it was trauma. And sometimes even just hearing that word can be sort of jarring. But as this teen worked through this program, one, he came to understand, okay, what I experienced was trauma. And then he came to understand this concept of, what will I call this? A concept of grappling with ambivalence. Sometimes kids who experience trauma think that they're doomed. They think that this is it. This was my life. I was handed this hand of cards and this is just what I'm going to have to be. And if we can help youth, like this teen that I'm thinking about in particular, he came to understand that your history doesn't dictate your future. Just changing that worldview changes a kid's total outlook, changes the decisions they make in their daily life. It's a total game changer.
In this scenario, what was the youth or youth fitness or sports component? Like, what was that environment?
Yeah, the environment actually, it was a really positive sport environment because this kid played on a team that felt really supportive. And he was able to draw a lot of the parallels between failure in sport and in fitness. You know, if I want to be able to do 20 push-ups in 20 seconds, that's also competition with myself. And that gives you opportunities to fail. This is my favorite thing about fitness and sport is failing. The more we fail, the better we are at understanding success. And I think that's the element that he was able to take from his sport team to help him understand, yeah, I failed 500 times trying to figure out this drill, but that doesn't dictate my future.
Is the key message that you would want fit kids and some of our peer organizations, you know, 1 to 2 to 3 pieces of advice to really focus on to make sure kids are getting the most out of our programs?
Fitness isn't just about your physical body. It's about developing a person. So when we work out with kids, the messaging can't just be, but you need to have a healthy cardiovascular system. Because that's only part of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think another one is that it's just fun. And kids need to just play and have fun and have opportunities to explore. So, you know, when things don't go as planned and you had 5 drills that you wanted to do and they're not doing the drills and everything got derailed, that's okay. That's totally fine. As long as there's relationship building and, you know, you're still being intentional about supporting a person, that's totally fine. And then I guess I would say I guess this feeds into it is the intentionality of it, that every day when you step in front of a youth, remind yourself what you're there for and remind yourself why it matters.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Is there anything else in this vein that you want to raise or emphasize, or otherwise I think we're near the conclusion?
No, you know, David, I'll emphasize my gratitude for you and for the work that you do, because it's people like you and organizations like Fit Kids that this is why there's going to be a difference. And this is why kids have the opportunity. So thank you for what you do.
Certainly appreciate those kind words, and of course the feeling is mutual. I mean, I've known of your work for so many years now and understand what you bring to the table, and very much appreciate your time on this call today.